I'm not sure which of the items from last week one would point to, but obviously the OPEC decision was at the end of the week, and like a lot of things that happened ultimately during the week, it was somewhat counterintuitive in the reaction. I.e., oil prices rose after this agreement when you would have sort of said they would have fallen. They rose after the SPR release when you would have thought they would have fallen. These are counterintuitive times. Let's kick off with Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, currently in London, where it is the crack of dawn. Christoph, good morning.
Good morning to you. That's right. And it's cold and it's windy and it's not anywhere close here as nice as where you are.
It's bullish.
So if I look at last week, I agree partially with the counterintuitive, but things have taken a turn for the worse, I think. Actually, I have great regrets because I couldn't make it last Sunday when all the bulls were meeting and I preaching for months. Things are going downhill.
Exactly.
I couldn't listen to it. But there's two things. The most important event of last week, actually, I don't think is the OPEC meeting. The most important event is what is unfolding in Russia and Ukraine. And that we can come back to later maybe, but that really does not look good. And it looks as if there is another chance for the West, the EU and the Biden administration to underestimate the depth of the currents, which are sort of the resentment which is running through Russia's elite and leadership, where they really believe that the Ukraine is Russian and that NATO and the West are trying their level best to wrangle it. This is the kind of thing where you look from the outside and you think, what a stupid thing to do, and maybe Putin is just scoring points and wants to have a meeting with Biden or something. But it's not like that. It's running much deeper. And I'm happy I used to live in Russia, and so still have friends, and I'm happy to talk more about it later. On the OPEC question, I think this is another sequel in the movie OPEC as the new central bank for oil and how do we steady the ship. I think OPEC Plus has done an excellent job so far in estimating demand growth and increasing supplies at lockstep so that prices were not steady but upward moving. And they are now betting a little bit on Omicron not being as bad as the initial situation suggests. And that's also reflected in comments the Saudi energy minister, His Highness Abdulaziz, gave him. He says, Omicron will turn out to be more shallow than Delta, and the economic impact will be less than the lockdowns which we have seen in the past. And it is an attempt the price reaction is understandable because it is an attempt to introduce more flexibility. So you steady the ship and say, we continue until we know the course which we have charted, which is the 400,000 increase per month. But we put into place a fast response structure, which means we see this now as a continued meeting. And all we need is to grab the phone if we hear any evidence that the situation is getting worse indeed, in fact, not in fear, then we will react and be able to cut output immediately. And that kind of signal went down, I guess you could call it well, if you're sitting in an oil-producing country with traders, and led to a stabilization of the oil price. And as I've long been argued, the oil price should be somewhere between 70 and 75, and that would sort of leave the ship steady. But that's where they managed to catch it. So it didn't fall further, because if you would break all the rules, if there would be no political production cuts, we all know oil prices would be much lower. So I think that's what they did, and I think that has seemed to have worked quite well. And now everybody is sitting there watching for Omicron. What is it going to be? Early indication is... what's it going to be? Fast spreading and more shallow, as some people say, or not?
Let's go to Adi Imsirovic, Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, across town or out in the country, so to speak. Adi, looking a little more deeper into the structure of the market, the decision obviously by OPEC on the supply side, but also the speculators cut their long positions quite heavily on net longs in terms of the investment fund side. And we saw, obviously, to a great extent, the idea that more supply may come into the market. Your thoughts on the decision made and the structure of the market at the moment?
Yep. Okay, start with, I mean, we've had a big collapse of backwardation in the market, which I think is the key, because as we know, it's the policy of OPEC or OPEC Plus to keep that backwardation going. That's the sort of backbone of this price strength that they expect.
That's the backbone of their success story, right? If you were writing
absolutely.
if you were writing the Christmas card, it would be, oh, happy Christmas on backwardation.
Absolutely, but I do totally agree with Christoph. I think the key that we got from this OPEC agreement was the fact that it was not adjourned. I mean, the beauty of this sort of success of OPEC so far, I call it OPEC rather than OPEC plus. I think plus is irrelevant at the moment. Is that they keep the market guessing, and markets don't like uncertainty. And whenever markets are uncertain, they sort of worry about things. So the fact that the meeting is not being adjourned, and God knows what that means. I mean, somebody sitting in Vienna with some old telephone, rotary phone, waiting for a call or something. I don't know. But it's the meeting hasn't been adjourned and keeps the market guessing. I think the key issue is, Sean, as you know, I've said many, many times, we're still in sort of demand shock mode. We have not exited this mode yet. So, and I think OPEC Plus has done an amazing job given the uncertainties regarding supply and demand. I don't think anyone can guess supply and demand at the moment what it's going to be. And Omicron is certainly not helpful.
Adi, I have to protest. Register.
Okay, well, you'll have a minute. Let me just finish.
You'll
have a minute. Yeah. You'll have a minute. So, according to the IMF, as you can see, is that certainly it will make a dent. I think Omicron is still a big question mark. But again, this issue that we don't know what's going to happen, the fact that people are closing borders and the jet demand is not going to pick up as a result, I think is a big issue. So Omicron is certainly going to make a dent, whether, regardless what turns out to be, because by the time we find out, demand is certainly going to slow down by quite a certain extent, just as we saw jet recovering. So this is where we are. We are in a very difficult market where suddenly people are going back to fundamentals, looking what the growth is going to be, what the China is going to be. China, I think, is not particularly bullish, as you know. Already, there's a big crackdown on the teapots. There's, through various environmental inspections, there's a big issue with the Olympic Games, Winter Olympic Games coming up, because that probably is bearish demand, in my opinion. Because they will make sure the industrial activity is such that the air is clean and that there'll be less mobility and so on and so forth. So we kind of gone a little bit back to the sort of fundamentals, and then I'll hear. Yeah,
I was just going to follow up on the point of explaining why oil prices rose after OPEC's decision, rather than you would think intuitively that they would fall. More supply equals weaker price.
Because,
why do you think
Sean,
there was a
It was not adjourned. People realized that, hey, this is not plus 400 is not the end of the story. Actually, it could be changed tomorrow. So even though on the face of it,
but that's very, always the case, isn't it? I mean, ultimately,
no, but this
month to month is. I mean, month to month is
the first time ever that the meeting has not been adjourned.
I mean, that's nonsense.
It's still ongoing.
It's just semantics. It's like crying.
Of course it is, but it's very clever semantics. I think in terms of market sentiment, they're very, very clever semantic and a very clever way to end the meeting. Whereas on one side, you're telling the United States, okay, fine, we'll give you some more oil. But then you're really telling the market, well, you know what, if this Omicron turns out to be not as, not as benign as we thought, we're going to cut again, and we're going to cut very, very soon. So
I would sort of take the view that OPEC increasing 400,000 barrels a day has not happened, right? This has been an announcement in which it has delivered much less than that. But I want to bring these two worlds together for Christoph's past and his far past, where Saudi or where the Gulf and Russia come together, that indeed this was a political decision on Thursday, Friday, whenever it took place, and not a market decision, because ultimately there is the Ukraine and this very red hot moment, and a gesture from Putin to the US, i.e. Russia is in the OPEC kitchen. So on this occasion, I'm going OPEC plus, and there's no way the Gulf Arab states could turn down such a heavy lobby campaign from the US government last week in the Gulf and say, no, we're defying you and we will stop increasing supply. So on a political level, this is where all the action was, and this is not a market decision. Christoph, Please take us away on
Yeah,
Ukraine.
no, I will take you and I will take John's position there. What Adi is saying is that among the traders, the reaction was hope springs eternal. And that's not enough of an explanation. I really think the analogy this time with the central bank is quite just think of the Fed. Long-term project is to raise interest rates in the spring. Short-term, they're fussing around with more or less tapering and everybody takes it seriously. Very similar here. 400,000, as you said, long-term in the pipeline. But in the short-term, who knows? And then everybody realizes there's a US delegation to Riyadh. There's trouble brewing in the Ukraine and all these things. I disagree. Of course, the Saudis and others could disobey if the Americans have done that before, but the mix
Well,
is
disobey is a big word, but to sort of to deny, to in the face
but
of such lobbying.
Yeah, but there is, as you said, there is this thing brewing. Also, you know, never say Russia doesn't matter in OPEC Plus or anywhere else. And what we have here is a dangerous situation. So we have now expectations been articulated by the Ukrainians and by the US, so quasi-official measure, that there's 795, I think, thousand troops, 100 battalions massing at the border of the Ukraine, half of which is already there, ready to interfere when the winter comes in January. Now, everybody from the outside would think this is hilarious, this is stupid, this is 19th century, and of course it is to some extent. But there are two ways to look at this, and they're miles apart, and people have not yet realized there are these two extreme ways. One is sort of the Western way. So Putin is grabbing for attention. He is, driving up energy prices. He's behaving badly. He probably placed the prelude to the Chinese acting more aggressively on Taiwan. All these things. And therefore, give him a place in the sun, let him talk to Biden, let him show a carrot and a stick. And then, as last May, where we had a similar situation just on a smaller scale, he will ultimately back off. Or in the worst case, he will send some troops and secure these eastern provinces, which are mostly Russian anyway. There is a Russian view, which has a Putin view, I would say, a view of his inner circle, which I think is correct and is important. And that has sort of three core components for this one. Number one, Putin is a man, and the people around him, including the military and the Secret Service people, who believe, as he said literally, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe, in his words, of the 20th century. So he is driven, and his policies from the beginning have been driven by a desire to put Humpty Dumpty together to some extent. Think of the customs union, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. These are the core countries. Within that thinking, Ukraine is a core element and not some independent national entity. Secondly, what we have seen, that one of the things which irks them the most from the beginning is the expansion of NATO. In Russia, there is, I don't know if it's true or not, but everybody believes that Bush promised Yeltsin that NATO would not expand into the post-Soviet sphere if they would let go and turn to let go of the rest of the Soviet Union and withdraw and turn in their nuclear weapons. Everybody except Russia turned in nuclear weapons at the time. But then NATO did not only expand into the entire sort of sphere around them, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, all these former socialist European countries, but also into ex-members of the Soviet Union, like the Latvia, Estonia, and the Baltic countries there. And to top it off, when the Russia fell militarily at its worst and Putin had just come to power, NATO bombed Serbia, an old ally of Russia. And that sits very deep. So this fear, this paranoia that NATO really is sort of the one obstacle which prevents them from putting Humpty Dumpty back together.
Yeah,
and
I think
the Ukraine is
okay. I was just going to interrupt there and say that I think there's clearly, I concur with a lot of that, but also would point that I think within Russia, not all ducks are lined up. There are not, there's a country there exhausted by 20 years of Putin and all of his dramas, and all they want is a welfare check. Adi, your thoughts as you are from a former Soviet sort of outreach post, what do you think of the politics being painted by Christoph and its connectivity to the oil markets?
Well, having come from Germany, I think Christoph's probably, probably feels a little bit more. Having come back from Bosnia, I feel it too as well. I think one thing that Christoph failed to mention, and I think it's hugely important at the moment, there's a massive amount of tension at the same time on Putin's chessboard in the Balkans as well. I think between Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, I think there's a huge amount of tension going on right there. Serbia has just purchased about $5 billion worth of weapons. And what's going to happen in that part of the world is also a big question mark. But these are all sort of pieces on Putin's geopolitical chessboards. And I think, sadly enough, I think purely on political side of things, I think Putin is way ahead of the game in terms of compared to Europe and the United States. I think he's already got all his moves worked out, whereas Europe and US is being extremely proactive. Not proactive, sorry, just the opposite of proactive, just reactive. So yeah, it's hard to disagree. I think there's a lot of tension now. I think that if something happened in Ukraine, if something happened down in Bosnia and Croatia, I think it would be extremely dangerous. And I think Putin is not ignorant to that fact. My guess is that he's more using all these things as a pressure levers, and I would like to think so, because otherwise I think we all have to be rather worried. But I think he's using that as the pressure levers to get something back, and hence the Tuesday discussion between Biden and Putin on Biden's insistence, because he's worried, because he doesn't really have an answer right now. If Putin did invade Ukraine, what would happen? We just don't know.
Well, you'd certainly think, and I don't want to get too off-piste here, that this is a window of time in which both on the China-Taiwan question and the Russia-Ukraine question, it's like, is this a window of time that you need to grab if indeed that's your long-term intention, not because it's the ideal moment, but because the window may close going forward. But Christoph, looking a bit more closer to home on this OPEC decision, I think there's also an internal component to this, obviously the geopolitical position we've just talked about, but also internally, in reopening the wounds of August in terms of how we had this OPEC agreement formatted, with the quotas and the idea that, quote, we're growing supply each month towards a bigger quota for the UAE as well as others, that to suspend may have been problematic given where this was born. Your thoughts on that looking forward?
I think that's correct. And I would personally go one step back further. And I would say this is reopening the wounds of April 2020. Because if you think at how it was playing out with this SPR increase, and where still, I would think it was mostly incompetence, but it was also then used, of course, from the US side to talk to Saudi Arabia. And it reminded me of this remote possibility in April 2020 of the three biggest producers to somehow get together and steer the market. And I think we have seen another example of that, where they, not completely in agreement from the beginning, but they moved, each of them in their own way, and they came to a livable agreement with this release on the one side and the continued production increases on the OPEC side. And that, of course, is going to be tested by what we just discussed. If there's a small chance of war, only one has to be clear about this, but there is a big chance of this escalating, and then the next game will be a sanctions game. The US will impose all sorts of sanctions against Russia and so on, and that will have direct consequences for OPEC Plus, because then the question is, how should Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab countries, the OPEC countries, behave with an ally which sort of moves in unexpected ways in other in political territory, causing the US to increase the pressure on Saudi Arabia, other than saying, you have to be careful whom you side with. That is the uncertainty which overlays the oil market. And I'm not sure should this play towards higher or towards lower prices, but it will increase volatility.
Andy, the other big story last week we haven't even mentioned was Jay Powell acknowledging that the need to possibly accelerate tapering. And then we had the jobs report at the end of the week that beside the headline looking weak, ultimately this was a positive jobs report in the sense that more and more people are entering the job labor market as they count them in America. It's a little bit odd, but those in the market looking for work is increasing all the time and back to pre-pandemic levels when you think of the sort of core working age group. So all in all, a positive, but the acceleration of tapering, your thoughts on what that means for the market?
Well, it's pretty basic sort of economics 101. Increase in interest rates are not good for commodities. Any storable commodities like oil are going to have a higher cost as a result of that, resulting in sort of less backwardation and weaker market and less carry in the market. Now, macro factors overall, I think, are important for the market, but I think at the moment, I'm sorry to take you a little bit away from that one. I honestly think that they're sort of at the moment less important. I think, and one very important thing that we didn't mention this morning is, even though Iran doesn't look that promising, I'm not so sure. I'm sort of more of a Iran optimist, well, relatively speaking. I think there was some leaks last week about sort of, Iran discussions not going well, and the hardline Iranian negotiators actually going back on some of the previous agreements. Well, I would take that with a pinch of salt, simply because it's all these leaks are part of a negotiating strategy. But if Biden wants to reduce the price of oil overnight very quickly, I think for him that's the obvious button to press. So I'm not quite sure what that's
and Venezuela, you might say.
Absolutely. But I think with Iran in particular, I think in our estimates has at least 140 million barrels stored oil. You could get up to 1 million barrels very quick a day overnight.
Right.
Very quickly. So I think that's the obvious button to press. I'm sure you discussed SPR to death, but SPR, everyone knows SPR is not working. Okay, it doesn't work, but they still press that button. Why did they press the button? Well, because it was there. They don't have many buttons.
Have they physically released it?
Sorry?
Have they actually physically released it already? They just made an announcement, no?
Yeah, they made the announcement, but that's the whole idea. It's just a button that they're pressing. Well, they're releasing, 50 million barrels of Maya in the US in the next few months, and which is going to be oil, which is going to be replaced in a few months.
I suppose you'd have to pay attention less to the barrel numbers, but also to the fact that these countries, how disparate country, China, India, the US, England, all sort of came together and said,
China hasn't.
China hasn't yet, but they've certainly signaled positively, and they did release from their own SPR a few months ago. So I think it is something you would have to pay attention to. But Christoph, jump in there, but also address the sort of macro monetary position in the US, if you would, please.
So on the SPR release, I think that was more or less a failure. 50 from the US, and you do have to look at the numbers, 65 total. No China, Japan, as far as I can see, only a promise, and a little 5 million or so from India. So that was much less than they had hoped for.
Don't forget the UK.
Yeah, but the UK, the big player everywhere. But let's look forward. So I subscribe to what Adi said about Iran and who knows, potentially Venezuela. So on the supply side, pretty easing up picture. But also on the demand side, it's not that we can't say anything. We know that trouble in China continue. We know that the housing sector meetings there, the company going busted, they have their work cut out for them. That doesn't look to me as one of the biggest, strongest demand centers, which it has been over the last few years. And so when you take the pieces of the puzzle together, and on the demand side globally, what we are seeing, is I can just repeat it, and I don't know why, is demand coming in exactly where you would expect it historically if you take into account this efficiency improvement, as if COVID had never happened. The 21 number will be exactly what it was expected to be from the viewpoint of 2019, given the lower GDP. So a lower number than the market had expected overall. When you put all these pieces together, it looks to me like a market which is weakening, not strengthening, if you leave aside all this geopolitical tension.
Okay, let's go to the survey question, just get the room's view on some of the bigger questions. Which will be the biggest factor to determine the direction of oil markets? And I should have added there, perhaps in the near term rather than, but ultimately in the near term. Accelerated tapering, which is what Jay Powell announced last week. OPEC plus decision, which came at the end of last week. The Omicron variant, or for the Ukraine-Russia tensions, which will be the biggest factor to determine the direction of oil markets over the near term? I welcome your views on that. And then we'll talk, finish up about the week ahead. Christoph, obviously some of these factors to play out, the call between Putin and Biden on Tuesday, also the inflation report due out midweek and so forth.
And the big rabbit in the hat, I think, will be when and how scientists come up with an assessment of Omicron. That's what everybody's waiting for, and nobody has a way of knowing. Everything has been said on that. I think nothing we can add, but that's the biggest. And then I think what happens on Tuesday in the Putin-Biden meeting, especially to see whether Putin is willing to cook it up further after Biden certainly will try to prevent that, is going to be of interest to oil markets. And the inflation report, I don't expect to show much relief or much change either way, but maybe there's a surprise there as well. In general, I think it is also, we need to continue looking at China because it just doesn't look as stable as it used to be.
On the point of the inflation argument and the idea of accelerating tapering, Christoph, with the jobs report last week, do you think that will have a big impact, not so big impact on the direction of the oil markets vis-a-vis if the US does, for example, move into a much, like he said last week, that we should get it done months earlier. Months earlier means like in the next 2 months, essentially, because it was only going to be a 6-month exercise.
It does have an impact, but it's an impact which, different from other parts of the market, in the oil markets is correctable. Because what happened to the market in general, when they heard that, they were shocked, and the markets went in a bit small tantrum, and I think are prepared to go into bigger tantrums, because it was rather clumsily coming out of the blue sky, and they thought they had already agreed to the smoother path, which was discussed a few weeks ago. And oil markets generally are affected by that sentiment, but oil markets have their own corrective. If then this forever meeting OPEC Plus suddenly raises its hand and says, okay, in that case, we cut production a little more, then oil markets can develop quite differently from the rest of the commodity and other markets. And that is something that should not be ruled out, because OPEC Plus certainly has no intention to let the oil market fall in lockstep with the rest of the market if it happens.
Let's see the survey result and give Adi a last word here this morning. Omicron seems to be the big ticket winner. Nothing else matters, which I suppose works in both ways. Your thoughts wrapping up, Adi, is the Omicron it built into the price now and it's only an upward movement, or is there more downside potential?
Yeah, I mean, Omicron is the key thing, and I'm glad that the market sort of most of your participants agree with me. I think Omicron is the unknown, big unknown. I'm not afraid of Omicron. I mean, here, I know we can't say much medically. I'm lucky enough at home, I can discuss some of the medical aspects of Omicron. It's most likely to be less virulent and more infectious, which is a good thing. So if that's
like a cold,
correct,
right?
If that's correct, we are going in the right direction, and I think still that vaccines will provide some support. I think what's very important, somebody said in discussion with me, I think a couple of days ago, that what really is important is the vaccinated part of the GDP. So, that's the key thing where we are right now. And I think that's why Biden and everyone else is pushing for more vaccinations and more boosters. Other than that, I think it's a very busy week. So I agree with Christoph on China and the emerging markets as well. The emerging markets are not looking that brilliant. China could be, somebody put, I think in your chat as well, Evergrande and all of that. It's really looking more and more like, Chinese subprime situation. And with everything else that I said, with crackdown on teapots, with the Winter Olympics, it's not hugely bullish.
Even that story about the tennis player seems to be getting out of control, like it's becoming a major issue that he could even derail the Winter Olympics.
Well, I'll tell you what, it should be. I think it should be getting out of hand. It's a pretty serious human rights issue, and this is not the first human rights issue in China, so I think it should be on the front burner. I think that, so this is. But
really my point is on it, not that it shouldn't be from the Western point of view, or from the external, or from the World Tennis Association. Right. But China's management of it is incredibly head in the sand poor.
But
there's a loss of control.
Yes, I mean, they've never been good at this. This is, command and control instruments, just delete it and put people in prison. I mean, as simple as that. You can't get much better than that. But I just don't want to leave this all on the bearish side of things. On the bullish side of things, I must add that, we will see probably Saudi OSPs picking up a little bit. They're coming out in the next few days. And I think that the only worrying thing, even though there's plenty of non-OPEC supply expected to come out in the next 12 months, there's very little spare capacity being left in OPEC. I think looking forward, I'm looking a year ahead or so.
Yeah.
Very little. I mean, outside Saudi UAE, I mean, and now we're going back to the questions of what is the Saudi capacity, what it really is, and so on. Not that we'll probably ever test it, but they and the role of OPEC Plus, if the demand keeps picking up, what are they going to do? And the power of OPEC, because all the power is in that spare capacity. Once they're out of it, so what's next?
Well, that's a good question to end on. End on a question. As I say to my 12-year-old, stop answering my questions with a question. The idea that the longer term consequence of the reservoir damage that's being done in places like Angola, Libya, Iran, Venezuela, even though there is capacity, there is lots of barrels of the ground. As we saw, we didn't even mention Shell in the North Sea, the withdrawal of capital available for the rehabilitation of all of those fields may indeed be challenging. I would just wrap up with one note on because it is, I think, slightly tangentially connected to the Iran talks and the possibility of those barrels that are there already coming. And that is the increasing stress, the water stress that Iran is currently facing is quietly, and maybe not so quiet for those directly engaged, but becoming, I think, a massive issue in Iran that could impact a lot about the stability of the country in a medium term. And the idea that there's close to 100 million Iranians and migration and all of the issues related to that. We're talking very fundamental water stress here, never mind water needed for industrial purposes. That may have sobered up some minds around in order to facilitate the investment needed there to get water into the places where it's needed, and particularly agricultural in Iran. So it's something to watch if you haven't been paying attention to that. Water stress in Iran is not a tomorrow issue. It's very much a today thing. Thank you, Christoph. Really appreciate it. And Adi, our London stalwarts, our England. Well, Merry Christmas, I suppose, is the great thing about being in places like that. You get to enjoy all of the jingle bells of it all. Whereas we have to go out and barbecue our hamburgers. It's not quite the same thing.
Poor you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Have a great week. We'll be here every morning, 10:30 UAE time. All the best. Cheers.
All the best.